Thanks, Chris. And thank you all for being part of renewable energy efforts and putting your own personal time into it and gathering once a month to try to advance the effort. We all have an important role to play. Unfortunately, some people are playing a role on the other side of the effort, but our job is to try to get everybody involved in a way that solves the problem that's going to affect us all. It is affecting us all. So I want to start off with a personal background. I'm going to give a brief background and how I became aware of this critical issue and how I chose to engage. It's been a trip, and as I continue to cycle through climate education, political education, recycle again through, I keep coming back to the solution and path that I will be describing. And through this process, I've become an engaged citizen, and I have found hope in this time of such division we have politically. So I'll share that with you as well. I'll start at the beginning. Slow start. West Virginia. And for me, I grew up seeing this kind of scene throughout the state, and for me, it's a beautiful picture. I see the autumn leaves, I see the power of the coal, and coal mining is an honorable job. It's a dangerous job. It's a job that carried a lot of health risks for the miners, but it was an important part of the economy. In West Virginia, as a young boy, I also got my first exposure to politics. In an interesting way, my parents, what I remember of politics at that time was the complaint of the political machine run by the Democrats and union leaders. And that's what ran West Virginia. It's interesting, West Virginia has more, they're not all Democrats, so don't get me wrong, but it has more governors that actually served time. Not just got indicted, but actually served time than any other state. Not something to be proud of. My father was a chemical engineer, and when I was 5, he changed jobs and we moved to New York. And I don't know, for those of you closer to my age, you might recognize this. This was the extent of my environmental awareness or my environmental education when I was young. So I went to public schools outside New York City, and this is not my high school graduation picture. Anyone know who it is?
Alfred E. Newman.
Right, Alfred E. Newman. And Alfred E. Newman was the poster child, or the sort of guy that showed up on the cover of a magazine called Mad. Mad magazine. I never bought it, but I always remembered it. I had some friends that bought it. It was a great, funny magazine. But that's one childhood memory that I have. And the other one that shows up that has relevance here is when I was in kindergarten and grade school, we used to go through duck and cover drills. And for those of you that are young, have no idea what this was like. Here we are, these little kids. And we have these, go to school and see what size a desk is for first and second graders. We'd get under that desk. That was what we were doing to defend ourselves against a nuclear bomb. And we trained that way. And it was incredible. But it was a real risk, and it was countered only by spending trillions of dollars to build an overwhelming array of nuclear weapons that would destroy the Soviet Union many times over. The policy, as many of you may know, was also called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. What's the relevance of this MAD analogy? Nuclear war, in my opinion, is, and I think in the opinion of most people, is universally accepted as the true existential risk to humanity. And we have paid and continue to pay an enormous amount of money over the years to manage it. I would argue that nuclear winter is first, but second right behind it is the risk of global warming and this human suffering that could be caused by global warming. And yes, I said could be caused, not will be caused, because I'm not certain of it, but it is still a risk of great consequence. I eventually went on to college, and my undergraduate degree is in mechanical engineering, which may be why I love pictures like this. Some of you may see these pictures. I know folks that I have that are on the left look at this kind of picture, look at a picture of coal, and they get all freaked out. But for me, this is industry, and it takes a lot of creativity to put this together. It also reminds me of the long road trips we used to take going back to West Virginia to visit my grandparents from New York, and driving through New Jersey past the oil refineries and the chemical plants, and my brother and I sitting in the back seat as, I don't know, 7 and 10-year-olds. Ooh, it stinks. Dad would always answer, boys, that's the smell of money. And that's the way much of what we now call pollution and issues were viewed back in that time. But it's also, this picture is a reminder of how much we owe fossil fuels and those companies that have extracted it, refined it, delivered it, for their invaluable contribution to providing the energy necessary to support and power the Industrial Revolution, thereby improving the well-being of humans across the globe. And speaking of energy, in my studies, I came across a new term, or one that was new for me anyway, energy poverty. According to the World Bank, 1 billion people in the globe have no energy at all, no electricity. Another 2 billion have very unreliable energy. If we want to deal with sustainable energy, we need to provide for that growing need, or we will not be successful, because we cannot expect them to live as they are now and not expect them to have the kind of energy that we have. The World Bank, by the way, in their forecasts determined that that should be provided for, and when they forecast out how much energy we use, they very generously gave those 3 billion people enough energy to power a 40-watt bulb for 4 hours a day. Don't think that's enough. Point is, we're going to need a lot more energy. So after engineering, I went into, after my engineering degree, I got an MBA, and I spent my entire career in finance, mostly on Wall Street, where managing risk is a moment-to-moment reality. In my last finance job, I had management responsibility for traders around the globe, and we traded anywhere from $15 to $20 billion a day in securities, and we carried positions overnight of $45 to $60 billion. Big numbers, big risk. And that risk management always came with a cost. And uncertainty was a constant reality. But uncertainty was never a reason to ignore the risk. What's my point? I naturally see the risk embedded in all our actions and the need to mitigate it. And this lens of risk management became an important perspective as I got deeper into the consequences of climate change. I love this image. And what's great about it is Boulder's right there in the center. After I retired, I looked around for some meaningful way to occupy myself, and for some reason, climate arose as the question, and I approached it as a true agnostic. I was really curious what all the fuss was about. Was it truly a serious issue? More importantly, was there anything this one guy could do about it? Fortunately, I was introduced to Max Boykoff, professor here that many of you may know. And with his guidance, I spent months with piles of scientific and economic papers, and it became clear to me that global warming, and I like to use global warming rather than climate change, I know it's not PC, but I think it's what we're really dealing with, was a critical issue, and that man was a primary, if not the primary cause. So instead of spreading the alarm, I decided to focus on advocating for a good solution, one that had the necessary attributes to solve the problem and get a buy-in from both sides of the aisle. Because in my opinion, any policy needs to be bipartisan if it's going to be durable and sustainable. So obviously we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Ideally, we can do it in a way that doesn't hurt the economy or jobs. It needs to be, for it to be accepted by businesses, to be friendly to businesses, transparent, fair, hopefully giving the opportunity to reduce regulations. And ideally, it has the ability to offset the regressive nature of higher energy costs and their impact on lower income people in our communities. And then the China question. We need to find a way to get this done without having to sit down at a table with 160, 130, or 95, or whatever it is, other countries, because we're never going to get an agreement, I don't think. So we need a policy that we can put in place that's not going to require international agreement. And lastly, but not less than anything else, it needs to be bipartisan, because as I said, we need to get everybody on board. Jim Henson's Storms of My Grandchildren became my Bible. I think he does a fantastic job of distilling the problem, and maybe more importantly, he has a solution that addressed all the issues that I thought needed to be addressed. It really resonated with me, and it seemed an easy sell to both sides of the aisle. Hansen offered a free market, sort of all of the above type of solution that unleashes American ingenuity to solve the problem without a macroeconomic cost. So what's his solution? A revenue neutral price on CO2. Fossil fuels, as I think everyone here knows, for all their benefits, are not priced properly because the negative externality is not embedded in the price. Pricing carbon is advocated by virtually all economists, left and right, as the cleanest, clearest, fairest, and most transparent solution. Embedding the cost of CO2 will allow us to make individual purchasing decisions based on price, and American entrepreneurs will be able to rely on the bottom line to support efficiency and sustainable energy investments. Now, revenue neutral just means the government doesn't keep the money. The net revenue side of the budget doesn't go up. They can either be used to reduce other taxes or returned as the revenues to American households. But I want to be clear. Pricing carbon is only part of the problem. As I was speaking earlier with a couple of folks here, and I know very well, land use and all of its different impacts are easily as much of a problem, and we don't have a way to address that I can see. But the thing I like about pricing carbon is it's clean, it's simple, and it focuses on something that we can address and encapsulate, if you will. And it's a way to level the playing field for renewable energy, which is why you guys get together. So, my strong preference is for a carbon fee and dividend for the revenue neutrality. Offsetting taxes or paying dividends both create jobs and grow the economy relative to baseline forecasts. Therefore, in either case, this risk management has no macro cost. It's true that studies indicate the economic benefits of offsetting taxes are slightly better than the positive impact of household dividend. But returning the revenues to American homes is the most direct and transparent way to offset the regressive nature of higher energy costs, at least for those who are least able to pay for it. The other thing I like about the dividend is it buys a constituency that will ensure its durability. Offsetting other taxes will not do that. So, you know I'm part of Citizens Climate Lobby. We have a specific policy that we're advocating. The first is a fee on carbon, as we're talking about, starting at $10 a ton, going up every year at $10, at the rate of $10 a year. And it's put in place at the very beginning point when it enters the economic stream. There's fewer points of taxing there, and every one of those points already have government taxes in place, or government fees. Fees somehow sound better than taxes, but they're the same thing. Dividend. So 100% of all the money that's collected goes back to American households on a proportionate basis, not based on your consumption, not based on your income, based merely on the fact that you're an American citizen and you live here, and you now have the choice to spend that dividend as you wish, improving your efficiency, energy efficiency in your home, buying braces for your 16-year-old daughter, or as one congressional staffer asked me, you mean they could use it to buy a lottery ticket? I said, hell yeah, they can buy a bottle of whiskey or a gun if they want to. It's America. And lastly, and as importantly as the first two, is the border adjustment that doesn't penalize exporters from America or those who import into America, doesn't penalize our manufacturers. With this adjustment, other countries that don't have a comparable price on carbon we will collect a tariff at the border when it comes in, and when we ship out to countries that don't have a comparable price on carbon, the manufacturer in the U.S. gets a rebate. This prevents the exporting of our jobs and the exporting of the generation of greenhouse gases, which would defeat the whole purpose. So what's the economic impact of this? Great study done by a group called REMI, Regional Economic Modeling, Inc. We reduce emissions, which is important. We generate another $70 billion a year in U.S. GDP. It looks like a big number, but it's not really when you look on the base of how big we are. But it generates 2 million jobs per year by the 10th year, additional jobs. And the dividends protect the lower 70% of the American households, which I think is critical. I put this in context. In year 4, when we're at $40 a ton, $40 a ton converts to about $36 for a gallon of gas. But the dividend amounts to close to $2,000 a year for a typical family of 4. So,
can you repeat the gallon price again?
So $40 a ton of CO2 is roughly 36 cents a gallon. Did I say dollars?
Yeah,
yes. Thank you for correcting. Yeah. Yeah. So it's 36. Yeah. So yeah. Thank you. 36 cents a gallon. So now I found a national policy solution, and what's the path? I mentioned Citizens Climate Lobby, and they have this great solution, which is basically Hanson's. What I really love about Citizens Climate Lobby is we're now over 110,000 volunteer supporters. Many of them are active, and we train people to lobby members of Congress, to lobby their staffs in DC and in district. We train people how to write letters to the editor, how to do op-ed pieces, how to give talks like this, how to educate folks on this solution that could be, should be supported by both sides of the aisle. And when I found this group, it all seemed so simple, because now we're constituents. All we have to do is let Congress know that we as their constituents care. That's when I really started to understand what it meant to become an engaged citizen. So before I get to the political side, before I get to political science, I want to just read a little science story, because I think it might explain something. A little girl asked her mother, "How did the human race appear?" The mother answered, "God made Adam and Eve, and they had children, and so was all mankind made." 2 days later, the little girl asked her father the same question. The father answered, "Many years ago there were monkeys from which the human race evolved." The confused girl returned to her mother and said, "Mom, how is it possible? You told me the human race was created by God, and Dad said they developed from monkeys." The mother answered, "Well, dear, it's very simple. I told you about my side of the family, and your father told you about his." Funny story. It's always nice to have a nice little funny story, but that story also talks about what I see as a huge difference when we communicate about climate between belief and conviction. I don't like to use belief. I like to use conviction. So seriously, don't assume science is the path. I had the naive view that all that was needed to be done was to get this information out to more people, and surely a wise policy would follow. Of course, I was wrong, and I will spend a little time on the reasons later. So I'm curious, how many of you ever had some opinion that you held very dear, but you did eventually change your mind on it? Well, this is interesting. Usually the audience has many more hands going up. But for those of you that changed your mind, how many of you changed your mind because someone told you you were wrong and stupid and you really needed to figure it out? I mean, that might work with a spouse, but it doesn't work with anybody else. Talking about science feels patronizing. And it's interesting that surveys, polls have shown when the research is done, that folks, the higher the education, the higher the intellect, the more effective we are at supporting our own intuitions and our own judgments rather than being convinced. We support our views. And of course, speaking of science, this is a different kind of group, so I'm not sure what the answer will be, but how many of you are comfortable with nuclear as an answer? About half. And how many of you are comfortable with the concept of GMOs? About half. Okay. Yeah, it's a loaded question, but GMOs have provided good and harm. Nuclear power can be the same way. And speaking of nuclear power in the Navy, I had a chance to spend a couple of minutes one-on-one with Senator McCain before he passed, God rest his soul. And I told him what I was doing. I'd just been in his office, seeing his members of his staff. And he said, "Well, what's your policy on nuclear?" And I said, "Well, Senator, we believe the market should determine that. If the numbers make sense, then we're all in favor of it." He said, he almost said son, but I don't think he did say son, but he said, I've been in the Navy and we got nuclear power on ships. If we can have nuclear power on ships, then we ought to be able to have it on land. And I said, well, Senator, we're agnostic on that. He said, agnostic's not good enough. So, yes, sir, I'll pass it on, I said. There's always this solution to communicating. I don't think so. So here I'm talking about two different perceptions, and I'm going to spend just a little touch on packaging. So there's Al Gore's movie, his first one. And I'm going to tell you that my opinion, Al Gore is not the poster child, but one of the poster children for partisanship right now. Why? Watch that movie again. I didn't realize this until I'd gone back to see it. He starts off the movie with, "Hi, I'm Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States." Now you've just shut off the audience that you want to reach. You've wound up and energized the audience that's already on board, but you've made it more political. But back to my Bible. What's unfortunate about Hanson's book is the subtitle, "The Truth About the Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity." Now, some of you may believe that. I might believe that. But what I'm here to tell you is that's no way to communicate to someone else who's not convinced. It's a bit like that. And who listens to that kind of approach? So then I started getting into the political reality. As you may know, our politics, and I don't know whether any of you know David French, but National Review is a right side publication. I love David French. Sadly, I think this is more true than when he said it 2 years ago. And it is true that our politics in the U.S. have always been tribal. Hamilton and Jefferson's tribes fought at each other's, it was terrible. We've had ebbs and flows, but I think we're now, my opinion, as low as we've ever been. But why is climate one of the weapons of this tribal warfare? And I'd say it's been manipulated by both the left and the right to be a rallying cry for their tribes against the other. It's a battle flag or a battle axe. I think the other issue that's so challenging for these times in our tribalism is that social media is far more powerful organizer than drums or smoke signals. And I think that this polarization is coming hand in glove with that. And as you may know, and social scientists tell us, once tribal dogma is established, no source associated with the enemy is trusted, and it usually takes the tribal leaders to make a change. But I do want to share a little good news. I've been lobbying in DC directly or in district offices around the country for 5 years now. And what is stunning, and I still take comfort though when I continue to notice it, is behind closed doors, no one on either side speaks ill of the other side like they do in public. They're respectful. They may disagree with the policy. They may say that's a challenge. I don't know why they're doing that. But this vitriol that we hear publicly does not exist behind closed doors. So I sort of chalk that up as a little bit of hope. And the reality that I think the public stuff is about keeping the tribes in line. I don't know whether you can read the caption in the back. "Your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country and your mother doesn't." And that's where that's pretty much where we all are. The folks that have views different from yours are coming from those views, or supporting those views and living with those views because that's what's best for the country. Sometimes, and maybe many times, it's unfortunately conflated with our opposition to the other tribe, but that's all part of it too. How do they determine what's best for the country? The next two slides will spend just a little bit of a view on the political science. And the first one is a paper coming out of Yale by Dan Kahane and Donald Bramman. It's about worldviews. I think individualist, you all can understand what that means. A solidarist, communitarian is collective needs, no pun intended. Trump, individual initiative. Hierarchist, authoritarian is pretty obvious. And egalitarian, emphatically denies that social characteristics should matter in how resources and opportunities, et cetera, are distributed. So where do you fit on here? It's interesting, this does not correlate with classic Democrat and Republican affiliations, but it does, or perhaps can explain the contradictory views that an individual can have on abortion and the death penalty. It's both death, but usually associated with death's okay one way, but not the other. Death's okay this way, but not that way. How does that happen? This paper is very short. I have a link to it in the slides. I recommend it. It's fascinating. It also, I think, helps explain the Trump phenomenon and how it is that you might look at someone and ask, why would they vote against their own self-interest? Of course, that's your opinion of what their self-interest is, because their self-interest includes their own tribe. So it's very interesting, very eye-opening and enlightening. This is a book. I recommend it very highly. It's a fantastic explanation of how we've gotten and how it is we are where we are, and a path out perhaps, but why it's so difficult. So I like the subtitle, which is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So Jonathan Haidt is a professor of social psychology at NYU, and his research shows that people are fundamentally intuitive, not rational, which shouldn't be a surprise for those of you that know David Hume. He said the same thing 250 years ago. So this is from Haidt. So when we contemplate why people who disagree with us will not listen to reason, and what we need to understand is that we use reason to justify our decisions, not as a tool to make a decision. If you think that reasoning is something we do to figure out the truth, you'll be constantly frustrated by how foolish, biased, and illogical people become when they disagree with you. But if you think about reasoning as a skill we humans evolved to further our social agenda, to justify our own actions and defend the teams we belong to, then things will make a lot more sense. So Haidt talks about 6 fundamental building blocks. You see only 5 on this chart, and that's because everyone pretty much shares a desire for freedom from oppression, liberty. So that's 6, and that's pretty much constant. But interesting that the definition of what's freedom and what's freedom from oppression is different for different people. But using that as a general category, everybody agrees. So we have the other 5. And what I want to point out is how liberals not only don't abide authority, sanctity, and loyalty, they reject it. It's not about being neutral about it, but they don't like it. Now, you may disagree with this research. Read the book, tear it apart if you want to. I didn't do the research, but I found it fascinating to see it, and it helps understand, it helps explain, I think, why we have such a challenge. So, political, challenging, but it has not always been thus. Nixon, EPA, 1970, Reagan, Montreal Protocol, 1988, and in 1989, an omnibus bill with 100 bipartisan co-sponsored Republican congresswoman from Rhode Island that did star ratings you see on appliances, demand side planning, energy efficiencies, all kinds of cool things. By the way, Claudine lives in Boulder, and she's always happy to address climate groups. So if you would like to have her address you, I'd be happy to make the introduction. So we all know about the loud lefty agenda. I'll spend a second on that in a minute. China, India, defunding or defanging the EPA. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the quiet side. And what's cool is behind closed doors, I can tell you that every single Republican office, not just my meetings, but my constituents, my fellow caucus members, every single Republican office behind closed doors recognizes global warming, recognizes that climate change is happening. Yes, behind closed doors, there's a debate about how much man's contributing to it, but every single office recognizes it. A. B. Republican-led Climate Leadership Council. The 2 names you'll recognize will be Schultz and Baker. Basically the same kind of dividend, carbon fee and dividend plan that Citizens Climate Lobby's advocating. The Bipartisan House Climate Solutions Caucus. This is the jewel, the greatest hope that I have for our bipartisan improvement in the country. back in the previous Congress, Citizens Climate Lobby, who was responsible for, or not solely responsible, but the driving force by creating the Climate Solutions Caucus, a Noah's Ark, one Republican for each Democrat and vice versa, got excited because we were up to 26 members, so 13 Republicans, 13 Democrats. When the election came, through retirements and election losses, it dropped down to, I think, 13. Right now, this Congress, with this administration, it's 90. 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats have signed up for the Climate Solutions Caucus. Now, they're not advocating our plan, but they're talking about doing something about climate, applying American ingenuity, not to hurt the economy, but they're talking about it. Interesting criticism one hears if you dig into this. You'll hear folks say, oh, they're just greenwashing themselves. You know, pick a name, so-and-so. He used to do that, or he voted to do this, whatever. He's just greenwashing. I say, I hear you. But let's look back 3 years ago. That person would never have allowed his name to be associated with climate in any way, and here he is voluntarily signing up. That's progress. 90 people, 45 Republicans, 45 Democrats. Republican-led bill on the floor in House right now to put a price on carbon. House resolutions, Republican-led, about climate. Mattis, our Secretary of Defense, recognizes climate's a big risk for national security, and major oil companies have been in favor of this, and I can tell you that just yesterday it was announced Exxon, because it's the same, isn't it? ExxonMobil, but it's still only $1 million. But they're going to give $1 million to lobby for a price on carbon, and they've announced it. I mean, you know, stuff's happening. So there's hope. We obviously have to recognize Loud's control of their respective tribe, but we should listen to the quiet as well and take hope. We're in Colorado. Does anyone here not know what a false peak is? Okay, so we've been talking about what? Republicans, right? And I'm Conservative Caucus, and the little sidebar conversations are, we know who the enemy is, we know who the deniers are, we know who the bad guys are. Well, I will tell you that this is the false peak. That little one that's the guy's just now getting up over, that's the Republican effort. That's the lefty side. Why do I say that? How many of you folks are part of the Colorado Coalition for a Livable Climate? Anybody here? Oh, good for you. I say that, why? Because if you were part of that, you'd be running away quickly, because they, not all of them, because we do have some of our own Citizens Climate folks going there to try to help shift things, but for them, the terms free market and profit are used as epithets. Catchphrase markets are run on corporate interests, not human interests. Pricing carbon, by the way, is neoliberal. Did you know that? I mean, the left is not going to go along with a generation of money without deciding how they want to spend it. So I think that's a big problem. So while it's easy for folks to try to blame Republicans, I don't see them as the real problem. It's a tribal issue. Democrats have made it a tribal issue. Republicans keep it as a tribal issue. But we need to come together and talk, and I'm very hopeful that the Climate Caucus will do it. But we also have a more fundamental problem. In fairness to our congressional representatives, what are they hearing from their constituents? This is a list of the priorities for politicians to consider. And for those of you, how many of you have ever lobbied? So if you've lobbied, you have the experience of going, you have your 10 o'clock meeting set, and you're there with your group or by yourself or whatever, and as you're waiting to go in at 10 o'clock, your time comes, one group comes out and you go in. And when you come out, another group's going in. And every one of those groups is leaning into the table, telling the member of Congress or telling the staff member why what they're there about is the most important thing, and why the congressman has to work on that, the congresswoman has to work on that. They've got limited bandwidth, they've got limited political capital, they've got limited time. Where does climate change show up? We can talk about how the parties might be divided on it, but if you're a member of Congress, you go to a town hall meeting, people are yelling at you about veterans benefits or whatever. They're not yelling about climate change usually. So that's a challenge, but there's hope. The millennials are coming. And one of the things that's really great, almost finished, the next two slides show the results of the survey of millennials done by the College Republican Club, College Republicans. Promoting clean energy, number 2 in the top 6 issues that they want candidates to support, and taking action to address climate change, not just the environment, but climate change is what they want out of their political party. So this is what we see in the future. But that's the future, and current politics are tricky. So I look through the lens of risk management. And as I mentioned earlier, I spent my career in Wall Street, and risk management's my natural lens. And I have come to recognize the great uncertainty of climate forecast models. I have a lot of experience with econometric models, which I like to say are always right some of the time. Climate models are vastly more complex. Therefore, I am not convinced we know how bad it will be or how quickly it will force itself upon us, notwithstanding what's going on in Florida right now. However, there's no question in my mind that ignoring the embedded risk of global warming makes no sense. It's also important to add that recovering from more intense weather events, dealing with climate-related refugees, building walls along the seacoasts, etc., will cost a lot of money, not to mention the related human suffering. And to paraphrase Vice President Cheney's 1% doctrine, if there's only a 1% chance of catastrophic global warming, quote, we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our response. It's not about our analysis, it's about our response. Now, he didn't talk about global warming, he was talking about weapons of mass destruction. But his point was, if there's a 1% chance, we should be looking at it, and it's not about our analysis, it's about our response. And our response in this case doesn't have to have a macro cost. So to answer Alfred E. Newman's question, I don't worry, but I want to do all I can to mitigate the risk of global warming, particularly given that it can be done at no macro cost. So we have a solution that I believe is compatible with Republican and Democrat principles. We can eliminate many subsidies and regulations. We can save money from recovering from problems. Of course, there's environmental and health benefits that are free. It's clearly a marathon, not a sprint. But until and unless something else with a greater chance of success shows up, I'll keep putting my effort on addressing global warming and working with my fellow CCL citizen volunteers to lobby Congress to act. Questions? I had to put... This was not my original slide for questions, but with what's going on in Florida right now, I couldn't help myself. So, anyway, I hope I was a little provocative. I hope there's some questions, and I'm happy to roll with however we're supposed to let this roll, Chris. Are we good? Okay. Yep. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the economic benefit of instilling a carbon tax? I know when I think about that, or whether it's the fuel standards, I think of sort of see parallels to what happened when the United States didn't make Detroit sort of adopt stricter standards back, I believe it was in the 60s, and in the 70s, then you had the Arab-Israeli conflict heat up, and then you had the oil embargo, which I personally don't remember, but that really was the beginning of a very tumultuous time for Detroit. And the economic, I hear very little though about sort of the economic benefits of putting these types of charges in place to fuel innovation and economic growth. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that for us.
Great question, thanks. So, and you make a point, talking about fuel embargoes and our dependency on fossil fuels. It's another reason why what you guys are doing is so important, because we need to get away from our addiction and our dependence on fossil fuels. But to answer your question, when you capture money and you do it in this gradual, transparent way, that by itself, if it weren't distributed back out into the economy, would depress the economy. So if the government just kept it, it would depress the economy. When you reduce corporate income taxes, or you reduce personal income taxes or payroll taxes, then people have more money to spend. That's why the economy gets stronger. Same thing when you give out dividends. As I said before, when you lower the taxes, that helps the economy, the general taxes, because you're taxing what you don't want, which is greenhouse gases, and you're reducing taxes on what you do want, more production. So the nice twist about the dividend, which, as I said before, is slightly less beneficial to the economy than reducing taxes, is that folks now have money to spend on the economy. And industries that improve are healthcare, education. There's a lot of industries that actually benefit from the dividends that would be spent by the American public. That help? Yes, ma'am.
Krista Michelet with the Nature Conservancy, Colorado. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's really fantastic. I know you talked mostly about carbon tax or carbon fee and dividend. I was wondering if you could talk more about other policies that you think would potentially have bipartisan support, or if you could speak to the role of states in particular and not just federal government policies.
Reverse order. I think that there's a lot of really great work being done at the state level, which is fantastic, you know, and sadly, it's more of a blue state, red state kind of effort in many cases. Not always, but that's sort of the typical pattern. My challenge with being wholeheartedly behind state efforts as opposed to being behind the national effort is because states can't put in the ring fence for a tariff. And I think that the sad part about not doing this right is that you can hurt your economy and you don't help. You export the jobs and you export the greenhouse gases. So that's why I want to focus on national. In terms of other policies, I don't know of another one that has a chance of being on both sides of the aisle. I know in speaking to a lot of the folks, the adamant folks on the right, or on the left, you know, there's more regulations necessary. We just price it, or we outlaw it, or we tell people they can't do it, or you know that kind of stuff. That ain't flying on the right side of the aisle. And I think there's a lot of folks who are on the left side of the aisle that don't really want to be told what to do themselves. They think it's okay for the government to tell someone else what to do, but they don't want to be told what to do. So I haven't found one. But I'm not stuck with this. It's just that the more time I've spent on it, the more time I find myself really feeling it's the path that I need to be putting my shoulder into. And I take great hope, as I said, in terms of the Climate Solutions Caucus and how large that has become. 45 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and growing. That help? Anything else? Yes, sir.
Who would manage this program and how would it be managed?
So it would be collected, the government obviously manages it, the government would collect the money, and the revenues would be distributed out, similar to the way the dividends go out in Alaska for their oil revenues, similar to how when Bush sent out a economic stimulus check when we were, I'll turn that off. So it'd be the government, and I said 100% of the revenues are going to be sent out. That's the intention. There will be, in the beginning, when the revenues aren't large, I think there's a number of somewhere between 4 and 5% initially would be for the additional administration necessary, but it probably goes through Social Security. I'm not sure, but I don't have that detail. But I can tell you that we have spent a lot of time with international lawyers and feel comfortable that there's no tariff problem with putting this in place, which is critical. Yes, sir.
Curious about your preference for the fee policy as opposed to the cap and trade, which would allow for trading between different polluters to find market efficiency, especially from the conservative perspective.
I could spend a half hour on why I like fee and dividend better. I'll just say simply, as an old Wall Streeter, I would love to get my hands on a cap and trade plan and do what Enron did to California, without regard to the impact it would have on all the individuals that would suffer because of it. It's not transparent. With this plan we're talking about, and we put the ring fence in at the borders, then we don't have to worry about whether or not other countries want to follow, but we put it in a cap and trade plan just automatically just has all kinds of gives at the beginning to get it accepted by industry. What kind of fraud happens in nations that are lesser developed and are run by autocrats? It's not clean, it's not transparent. Now, I've heard complaints about the cap and trade, or about the fee is not really allowing us to control exactly how much is being emitted, and to, we don't have that ability to know exactly what's going on. I would say that cap and trade is even worse because it only picks big industries. It doesn't hit every single polluter or every single source of greenhouse gas. That's the thing I love about this, unlike cap and trade, is each of us, if we choose in February to buy blueberries at Whole Foods, we're going to pay more because it costs that much more to fly them up here. And we should. Under cap and trade, that would not be addressed. Now, I don't want to say that we shouldn't be allowed to buy blueberries, but we ought to pay for the externality. Yes, sir.
Could you talk about why a company like ExxonMobil would want to price on carbon?
Yes. A couple reasons. And why any business would want to price on carbon that has a tremendous dependency on fossil fuels, their generation or their consumption, is right now, you don't know, if you're a businessman, you don't know what the lay of the land is going to be in 5 years. And you're trying to plan a 20 or 40-year investment. What's the regulatory environment going to be like? Who's going to be in charge? Is it Democrats going to come in and put in lots of regulations or not? Who knows? They have the transparency. They can see what the price is. And they're hoping for a trade-off on reduced regulations, which I think is completely fair, if the price addresses the regulations that we're rolling back. And Exxon, Mobil, and any of these other big companies are full of bright people. And their view is, we know what the rules are, we'll outcompete the competition. But we just need to know what the rules are. There's enough uncertainty already. Another problem with cap and trade. So you don't know what the price is 5 years from now. With this, you do. Anything else? Yes, sir.
About the Baker-Schultz plan, I wonder, well, two things really. One is if you would have anything to say about how, it sounds like on the very highest level, it's very much the same as the CCL plan, but I wonder if you have anything to say about differences. And the second part is, one thing I've heard about it, but don't know much about it, is that with the Baker-Schultz plan, the flip side, or an additional aspect of it, is to get rid of a bunch of regulations and just let the carbon tax do it. And I'm wondering, I don't know what those regulations are that they're talking about, so I don't know how I feel about that. But I wonder if the CCL's plan, does it say anything about something similar, like getting rid of regulations to go along with this?
Good question. So first of all, we start out at $10 a year. The Baker-Schultz plan starts out at 40. We go up at $10 a year. They go up at a slight increase above cost of living. So they start out higher and don't go up as quickly. We start out lower and go up more quickly. I like ours better. I would support that if that's the only one that we would have. We do not have an opinion on regulations. They do. They've been advocating, and it's one of the reasons why ExxonMobil and others have signed on to their plans, because they're advocating for a rollback of related regulations. I don't know how they're describing or defining those related regulations, but for me, I think that's a good thing if the regulations that they are rolling back are regulations that were put in place to do a poor job of what the market can do a better job of, if it's a direct offset or better. So if it's getting rid of all regulations, and no, I wouldn't be in favor of that, and I don't think Baker-Schultz would either. Yes, sir.
How does this deal with agricultural sources of greenhouse gases?
It doesn't deal with agricultural sources at all. As I said at the beginning, this just addresses the use of fossil fuels. So to the degree a farmer is, he's got a tractor that's not as efficient as another tractor, well, then he'll pay a little bit more for his gas. But it doesn't affect that. And we need to address that. I don't know how to do that. I haven't heard of a good plan. If there were one, I'd probably get behind that too. But what I love about this is it's clean, simple, transparent, relatively easy to describe. And both sides should be behind it if we can get past this tribalism. Yes, sir.
How do you realistically assess the carbon fee or the carbon tax for imports of goods?
I'm sorry,
for imports of goods? I thought you talked about having any...
A tariff? At the border adjustment,
yeah.
So right now, the government has the equivalent of a SKU. You know what a SKU is? It's a product identifier for, everything we import, they've got a line item for it. And every one of those line items has a corresponding product in the U.S. So it would be about looking at that corresponding product in the US and its footprint. Now, whether or not that footprint is the true footprint in an inefficient manufacturing facility in China, probably not, but that's the placeholder. So at least it's a placeholder. We're not going to go to every country and investigate everything, but we do have, it's a relatively simple way to do it, and I think it covers most of the bases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it wouldn't tell the difference between a company that's working overseas that's using green energy and not using.
True. If there's a company overseas in a country that has no price on carbon and they're shipping to the US, they're going to pay a tariff, absent some waiver. Yes?
Can you speak, changing the subject a little bit, can you speak to the discourse on renewables and national security, specifically grid modernization?
Oh, wow. That's a huge risk we have. I mean, our grid's very vulnerable. I can only tell you I've read some about it, and it concerns me. I think we ought to be doing something about it. It's a national security issue. I mean, there's a cyber. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff. So we should be doing something about that too. I don't know how to say much more than that. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering why the conservative side hasn't focused more on the economic benefits of clean energy. And a lot of times, you even listen to President Trump, and they point out China and they paint it in sort of Dickinsonian terms, sort of Oliver Twist, where the factories are coal-powered. But in reality, in a lot of cities in China and a lot of Chinese industry, they're quickly becoming the leader in a lot of clean energy areas because it's the #1 issue for the populace there. And it's the one area where they're really allowed to express freely. Why do you think here there's still why it's not being framed in more of a national economic competitiveness? I know the fuel cell battle, for instance, where China's making great strides.
I think the simple answer is our abundance of natural gas. And in a simple sense, from a national security perspective, we don't have to worry about it. And so when Texas puts in the biggest array of windmills, I think isn't Texas the largest source of windmills? That made economic sense. So they did it because made economic sense. So to your point, they do. Texas has sort of been known to be a red state, although who knows what's going to happen now. But yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's the right side. Business wants to look at the bottom line, and without pricing the externality of CO2, we're going to continue to expand our renewable energy as we have been, and it's accelerating, which is great. But we need to have a systemic change. And I would say that I come back to the bipartisanship. It's so critical that we have a bipartisanship here, because if we don't, then half the country, whoever jams it through, the other half of the country is going to hate it and going to be Jones to get rid of it. And they will do everything they can to cheat it. If we can get bipartisan support and the leaders of both tribes get behind this, then this could become the breakthrough for true sustainable renewable energy and our awareness of this issue. And we may have the kinds of signs I had up there with Smokey the bear telling us about, worrying about things, so that we can start becoming sensitive about what land use is. That's my hope. That's my hope. I ain't giving up. I ain't giving up. Anything else?
Who are you? The frog or the elephant?
We, Martin, we're the frog. And that pelican standing in rising water. Anything else? Okay. Chris?